Today we're going to cover macromolecules. We're going to get into a little bit of chemistry, and we'll learn about what these macromolecules are. So the basis of these macromolecules, first we talk about carbon. Carbon is really important. Makes up, we are carbon-based life forms. The reason why is that it makes up most of the life's molecules. So carbon can bond with many elements, including other kind of life-based elements, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and nitrogen, and we're going to see why. So what's special about carbon is that it has these 4 valence electrons. Valence electrons you learn about next year are the electrons in an atom that are that are able to bond with other atoms. So carbon has 4 of these, and which allows it to bond with many other elements. So pretty much an atom, the most bonds it can form with any other atom is 4. So carbon is one of the elements that can bond the most compared to the other life-based elements, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen. All of those other ones can't form as many bonds as carbon can. So this allows carbon to form kind of like the backbone of all of our life-based molecules because it can bond with so many other different elements. So living organisms are made of molecules that consist of carbon and these other elements that are written up, up above. So what's also cool about carbon can also bond. Carbon atoms can bond with each other, which gives carbon the ability to form millions of different large and complex structures. So it can form a single bond, like here in methane, so 4 bonds with hydrogen. It can form a double bond here, okay, in these molecules here. We got a couple other double bonds here. Here's a double bond, there's a double bond. It can also form triple bonds, which aren't pictured here. But chains of carbons, they can form these rings here. So it's just carbon's ability to bond with those 4 valence electrons allows it to form all these different shapes and to bond with many other different atoms. So the main idea there is carbon's cool because it has these 4 valence electrons that allows it to bond with many other atoms. So now getting into macromolecules. There's going to be 3 that we're going to be talking about right now. There's technically 4, but we're going to be just talking about 3. We'll talk about the 4th one later this semester. But the 3 we're going to talk about, first we're going to talk about carbohydrates. This is like the main source of energy that organisms use. Plants and some animals actually use carbohydrates for structural purposes, but mostly plants. Lipids, which are also known as fats, can be used to store long-term energy. Some lipids are important for, again, like we learned about with the plasma membrane or the cell membrane, forming that lipid bilayer to encase everything in the cell. And then proteins, we're going to be talking about those. They do important roles, like they control the rate of reactions that happen within an organism. They are used for structure, like cellular structures. Think of, like, again, the structure of your body, like muscles. They're used to transport substances in and out of the cells. We talked about earlier how there's protein channels within a cell membrane that allows things to enter in, some things not to enter in, and vice versa, things leaving. And they also help disease. So we won't be covering the immune system in this class, but your antibodies and macrophages that kind of engulf foreign bacteria or viruses, those are actually made out of protein. So just let's talk about the word macromolecule. So the prefix macro means big. So it's like the opposite of micro, which means small. So macromolecule just means a big molecule or giant molecule. It's made up of different hundreds or thousands of smaller molecules. So it's like a big puzzle piece or big kind of like necklace that has many different beads all paired up to make this one big molecule. This is through a process called polymerization. So poly means many, and like mer means parts, so many parts. So process of many parts coming together to make a macromolecule, also known as a polymer. So again, the idea of these 2 words here, monomer, mono means one, mer means piece, so one piece. Many of these monomers join together to form a polymer, so a bigger object, or in this case, a macromolecule. So you can have a polymer that's made out of identical monomers or different monomers paired up together to make a macromolecule. So maybe see this polymer here is made up of see blue, so like 4 different types of monomers. It could be made out of all orange monomers or blue monomers. So it depends on what macromolecule you're working with. So the 3 we're going to talk about are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. We're going to talk about nucleic acid at the end of the semester when we talk about DNA and RNA. Okay, so carbohydrates, again, you probably have some background in you hear carbs, complex carbs, or so they're the major kind of simple energy source for humans, quick energy. So like your breads, potatoes, pasta, sugar. So, if people are running a marathon, they'll carb load with a pasta dinner the night before because it's a quick energy source that they can use for this really exhausting marathon. The elements that the carbohydrates are made out of are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so to see a little more about that, when you're looking at carbohydrate, the monomer is known as a monosaccharide. So saccharide means sugar, so mono means one, so one sugar. So this is a monomer of a carbohydrate. You can have a disaccharide, which is made out of 2 sugar rings here. And then you can have a polysaccharide, which poly, the prefix means many, so many sugars together to make a more complex polysaccharide, which would be like your macromolecule. So you'll see carbohydrates, they often form this ring structure. That's, again, a monosaccharide called glucose. We'll get into that in a bit. Complex carbohydrates have many long chains of these rings, again, called a polysaccharide. So some common examples are ones that you maybe have heard of. Glucose, we'll be talking a lot about that one throughout the year, is a monosaccharide. That's the product of breaking down a polysaccharide that you would eat, again, like a starch, like from potato or pasta. You'd get that, break it down into glucose. Glucose, we're going to see later, gets used as an energy source that is used to convert from glucose to ATP. That's the energy source that your body actually uses. We'll talk about that again later this year. Fructose is a monosaccharide that's found in like fruit and also honey. Galactose is the monosaccharide, the sugar that's found in milk. And then you get into some disaccharide here, sucrose, so like your table sugar. So every sort of, candy is made out of sucrose, is when you pair up glucose and fructose together. So that's a disaccharide. Starch, you find that again in rice, corn, and potato. That's kind of used more for structural purposes in a plant. That's a polysaccharide. So starch is made out of many simple sugars paired up together. And then cellulose is like that very fibrous part of plants that doesn't get digested in humans. So that's you're supposed to eat lots of fruit and vegetables. They're high in cellulose. They kind of keep your digestive system going because you can't digest it or absorb it. So it kind of helps clean out your system. We'll talk about that later on when we talk about the digestive system later this unit. One special one, glycogen, is a polysaccharide that we use or other animals use to store excess sugar. So this is stored in your muscles, and it's a quick energy source for when your muscles need contraction. So when the level of glucose in your blood runs low, glycogen, the storage system here, is broken down into glucose, and that's released in blood for the energy you need to do all sorts of activities. So glycogen is a stored energy source of extra sugar or quick energy. You store a lot of excess energy for long-term need as fat, but quick energy storage is glycogen. Plants use a different polysaccharide called starch for their kind of excess sugar. Again, another important polysaccharide in plants is cellulose. So think of like celery has a lot of cellulose that gives it that kind of strength and rigidity. Next is lipids. Lipids are mostly made out of carbon and hydrogen and are generally not insoluble, are not soluble or cannot dissolve in water. Um, Common categories, you hear them as fats, oils, and waxes. Again, they're used for long-term energy storage. So a lot of us, most of men, especially Americans, kind of have this excess amount of lipids or fat used for storage energy. So we're really good at conserving our fat. It's hard to lose fat. Some lipids are important for, again, for plasma membranes for a cell. When you look at a lipid, it's made out of this one glycerol molecule, molecule, and with these three fatty acids. So that's kind of the overall. This is the polymer uh, lipid, and the monomer is made out of glycerol and fatty acids. So these are the two parts that make up the lipid. Glycerol and fatty acids make up a lipid. You often hear, I'm sure you've heard the word saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, but you don't probably know exactly what makes a saturated fat saturated, what makes a monounsaturated fat a monounsaturated. So we're going to talk about that right now. So a saturated fat would be like butter. These are solid at room temperature. Why it's called saturated, the word saturated means to be full. So the reason why it's called saturated is that in the chain of carbon atoms that forms the fat, any sort of bond that where carbon isn't bonded to itself, to another carbon, it's going to be bonded to hydrogen. So there's carbon surrounded by hydrogens. It's full, it's saturated of hydrogens. So that's why it's called saturated. And we're going to talk about why it's solid at room temperature. Monounsaturated means, mono again, one. It means that you have one carbon to carbon double bond. So it's not full, it's not saturated with hydrogen. That's why they call it unsaturated. And mono because it has this one double bond. So for example, olive oil is a monounsaturated fat. And these monounsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. Polyunsaturated, again, unsaturated means it's not going to be full of hydrogens all around the carbons. Poly means there's going to be more than one double bond. Okay, so an example is canola oil. Again, these are also liquid at room temperature. We're going to see pictures of all three of these structurally in the next slide. But when a person has like a high cholesterol problem, it's recommended that they eat a diet low in saturated fat because these are the fats that cause blockage in your arteries because they can form solid easily. It's recommended to have a diet high in unsaturated fat, which, they kind of recommend more monounsaturated fat with those single double bond, and some polyunsaturated fat. So because these are liquid at room temperature, so they don't clog your arteries like a saturated fat would. So structurally here's a saturated fat. So here it's like this carbon. So we have one carbon, we have a bond between these carbons here. But any other bond that the carbon has available is surrounded, it's taken up by a hydrogen. So it's saturated with hydrogen, okay? And because it has this kind of structure here, this is why it forms a solid at room temperature. Here's monounsaturated fat. So here's the one double bond, that mono, and it's unsaturated, meaning like this part is not saturated with hydrogen. So this little double bond here, it forms kind of this kink. This kinky structure is why it's liquid at room temperature. Same idea with the polyunsaturated fat. Poly, we have more than one double bond, so it's unsaturated. Not every bond that carbon has available, besides the one bond between the two carbons, not every bond is taken up by a hydrogen. So that's why it's called unsaturated, and we have more than one. So it's polyunsaturated. Again, we have this kinky structure which allows it to be liquid at room temperature. Okay, I'm going to continue on the next one with protein. So you will see in a moment.